Why were all these powerful men sexually abusing children? Do you feel like you understand that?
It's a really tough question. It's one that I get asked a lot. And on the one hand, especially as someone who went through this myself as a child, it's very hard to kind of imagine why an adult would do that. What would possess an adult to hurt a child in that way? I find that really, really hard to comprehend.
Demonic.
Yeah. And when you look at it at this scale, it becomes even harder to comprehend. And I think part of the why goes back to this idea of power, which is that, for whatever reason, at least some of these people were actually interested in sexually abusing children. Obviously, as you said, the people who have been named, apart from Ghislaine and Jeffrey, deny the allegations. Ghislaine and Jeffrey also deny them, but Ghislaine has been convicted, and Jeffrey is now dead. But allegedly, a number of people were interested in sexually abusing children. And that I can't explain. But there were also many, many more people who were around, who knew what was going on, or at least I find it very hard to believe, didn't know what was going on, certainly from the stories that survivors have told me about the people they saw around and what was happening in that situation. I don't think any right-thinking person could not question whether something criminal was happening. So there are a lot of people who were around, whether or not they committed any abuse, for them, I think part of the why is, again, being in that kind of inner circle of power. And Jeffrey Epstein, by all accounts, from obviously knowing people who were trapped with him for a very long time, was very, very good at manipulating people and using his power to attract other powerful people and promise them a lot of things and, make their lives better and help them live these lives of untouchable luxury. And they wanted in on that. And I think, again, that it's awful, and it speaks to, so many things about where we're at in the world, in terms of late stage capitalism and, so many structures that these people really do, they really were willing to let this happen, just because, Jeffrey Epstein was offering something to them that they wanted, which was, to be in a room with Bill Clinton, to be in a room with Donald Trump, to be in a room with Elon Musk. These are all, people that we've seen pictures of. With Epstein and with Bill Clinton, I reported a survivor saying that she actually met Bill Clinton with Jeffrey Epstein over a number of days. And so, those are facts. And those people, for them, they want power more than they care about protecting children or protecting anyone else. And it's a depraved and terrifying lack of humanity. And there were so many people who showed that that's who they were.
And how much credence do you give to the allegations that Epstein was working on behalf of a foreign government? We remember in 2019, the reporter Vicky Ward revealed that a former White House official said that Alex Acosta was told Jeffrey Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave the matter alone. Mm-hmm. We've since heard a former Mossad operative speaking on other podcasts, basically saying, yes, he was Mossad. Do you think that this was first and foremost a paedophile ring, or was there something more, even more to this horror?
I think it's important not to downplay the fact that I think it was first and foremost a paedophile ring. But as you said, I think it is safe to have questions about whether it was more than that. As you said, there is evidence that Acosta put together that sweetheart plea deal that I mentioned because he was told that Jeffrey Epstein was an asset and that he should be protected. So there is plenty of evidence to suggest that he was working for intelligence, and so that should just mean that journalists, that we should be asking even more questions about this, and yet still there's not enough kind of hard facts out there about what Jeffrey Epstein's role was in terms of being an intelligence asset. And I really hope that comes to light, because again, that's another aspect of the kind of structures of power in our society that have clearly played a role in this.
Well, I would say that for me, as somebody coming at it from the outside, there were so many questions raised. You know, the FBI had been aware of Epstein since the mid-1990s, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation. Pretty much all the survivors talk about the fact that there were these lenses peeking into his Palm Beach residence that everyone was aware of. And then, of course, you know, although Acosta has since retracted this admission that he'd said that, Epstein was part of intelligence, that was something that was reported back in 2019. And then I was referring earlier to Ari Ben-Menash, who's a former Israeli intelligence officer who'd become known for his claims regarding Epstein. And he'd said that Epstein wasn't just a wealthy predator. He was that. But he was also what he called an intelligent asset involved in honey trap operations, using women to gather compromising information on powerful figures for surveillance and leverage. I suppose for me as a woman, for me as a mother, for me as someone who was a little girl at a certain point, I look at this story and I think to myself, I still don't understand why the attraction was abusing children. Are we saying that all these people in power, those named and those not named yet, are just sick? Like, all of them are pedophiles?
It's such a hard question, you know, why is it this kind of child sexual abuse that is at the heart of this? And I think, you know, it's likely a couple of things. It's probably that Jeffrey Epstein himself, was a paedophile, and he's the one who kind of set all of this up from what we know. And for the others who allegedly abused minors as well, whether or not they are paedophiles, I suspect there's something which again links back to power, which is about being able to do something that the world almost unanimously agrees is one of the most egregious things you can do. And these people were being offered to be able to do that with complete impunity. And that is powerful. You know, that would make them feel powerful. So, you know, whether or not they are all paedophiles, I think there is something here which perhaps Jeffrey Epstein knew, which was that, you know, to offer them the chance to do something that almost everyone would agree is completely reprehensible and get away with it, means that you're a very powerful individual. And Jeffrey Epstein, from accounts again from survivors I know who were trapped with him, was very good at making people feel like that. And the sad thing is, if you know, he was promising them impunity, if that was the thing that drew them to it, he was right. You know, for almost 30 years, you know, and still now, he was right, because most of these people still haven't been charged. Most of these people who allegedly abused minors still have not been charged. So that's the really terrifying thing, is that I suspect, I mean, who knows? I don't think we'll ever be able to know which of them are paedophiles and which aren't, but I suspect what the draw card was, you know, just just how powerful you would have to be in a situation to get away with a crime like that, and to have someone say, you won't be punished, you'll get away with this, and he was right, and that's really, really terrifying. And I really hope that we fix that very soon, and that these people are held accountable for it, because I, for one, don't want to live in a world where you can commit a crime that, again, we almost unanimously agree is one of the most serious crimes you can commit, and get away with it.
Let me ask you about some Epstein's victims whom you've come to know personally. I have been reading Virginia Giuffre's book. It's both very, very difficult to read, but also her voice comes out in the book in a way that she sounds hopeful about life again, which I think makes her death particularly puzzling. Because if you've read the book, then you know that she actually rebuilds her life, has a family, has 3 children she adores, a husband she adores. She had a life. She'd rebuilt a life for herself and was on the cusp of, I think, going after some new people, I believe, before she died. What do you think is most misunderstood about these victims that you've come to know?
Oh, just almost everything. I mean, one of the things that I talk about a lot is the way that we as a society are still unbelievably attached to what we call rape myths, which are a set of beliefs around sexual abuse that are completely false, but held and strongly believed by the majority of people in this country, at least. And so, because for whatever reason, we are still so attached to these myths, and those completely false beliefs drive how the world sees these victims. And the result of that is that these victims have been re-traumatized again and again and again and again by people who whether they admit it to themselves or not, hold these false beliefs about sexual abuse and sexual assault. And so, I think with some of these victims who I now know very, very well, it's so hard to read what some people would like to suggest about them. The rape myths that we're talking about include things like they made up an allegation for attention, they made up an allegation for money, they did something they regret, and so they made up an allegation. When you know these people, it's so hard to see how anybody would make those assumptions. And so I really wish that more people understood that. And that's why I really wanted the book to focus on the victims themselves, rather than Ghislaine or Jeffrey, because every headline I saw when I got back to my hotel room after every day of the trial had a form of one of these rape myths in it somewhere, or was informed by it. So, the best example, I think, is Annie Farmer, who testified for a very long time about being abused, and about these terrible, terrible things that happened to her. And she talked about it for hours, and it was so brave, and listening to it was so powerful, and it was incredibly important to the jury. But then the defense came out and said, so she said that Ghislaine had bought her a pair of cowboy boots.
I remember this. On
one of their trips. And this is important because, again, this is something I really care about, this idea of grooming. The idea of Ghislaine making this purchase was really important to prosecutors, because it's an example of one of the stages of grooming, which is gift giving or providing a child with something that they don't have. So identifying children who are vulnerable, whose needs are not being met, and then trying to meet those needs. So buying someone a very expensive pair of boots is a really important way to show the jury Ghislaine's culpability in this. And on the shopping trip, according to the evidence, which the jury accepted, it was just Ghislaine who bought them. So Annie Farmer gave these boots to the FBI. She kept them for a long time, and the defense came out and said, "Oh, but these boots are scuffed. It looks like you've worn them." And she said, "Yeah, I've worn them," which firstly should be quite obvious because they were bought because she was going on a horse riding trip and she didn't have any boots. That's the reason that so she would have worn them then. But, she also said, yes, I've worn them since then. I wanted to try and reclaim them. And, anyone who has been in a situation where there's been grooming involved and gift giving involved, which I have, can understand why you would want to reclaim items like that. It made perfect sense to me listening to it. But the defense just said there is, basically said through questioning, there is no way that you are telling the truth about this abuse because you wore these boots later. And no right-thinking person, no person would wear a pair of boots given to them by an abuser. If you know anything about child sexual abuse, if you know anything about grooming, you know that most children will use the gifts that they're given even long after they've understood what happened to them. There's a lot of research into that. But that didn't matter because that day, the only thing that was in the mainstream media was the fact that Annie Farmer had been found to have worn these boots as if it was a smoking gun, and I counted, I think, 72 mentions of the word boots in the articles that night. And this woman had just testified about an incredibly traumatic time in her life for hours. And none of that testimony was in the papers. The papers just talked about the boots and the fact that she wore them as if this was proof that she lied. And, the coverage was shocking, but I wasn't shocked by the time I read it because I walked out of the courtroom. So there were only 4 of us in the actual courtroom, but there were overflow rooms. So there were other reporters who were watching it on a screen inside the building. So I interacted with a lot of those people. And as I said, for me, listening to that makes perfect sense to me, that she would wear the boots. Another victim, again, was cross-examined about the fact that she stayed in touch with Jeffrey Epstein after she escaped from him. Again, that makes perfect sense to me. We know that happens. I know that happens. There's a lot of reasons for that. Because the whole point of grooming and child sexual abuse is that it's incredibly confusing for a child to be betrayed by someone who promised that they would protect you. So, you do want to stay in touch with them. And again, so we'd hear that evidence. It would make perfect sense to me. And I'd come out and I'd just hear these male reporters in the gaggle kind of saying, she made it up. She's lying. And they said, I just can't imagine wearing the boots. If it were me, I would never wear the boots. I would never write the email to Jeffrey. And these things that are backed up by scientific studies about grooming that we know are actually evidence that it did happen rather than that it didn't happen. And yet this myth is, any myth that results in believing that victims routinely lie about sexual abuse is very attractive to us as a society, as I said, because we all, not us, obviously, but the majority of people believe them. So anything that leads you to that conclusion people will readily accept. So they just accepted that wearing the boots meant that Annie Farmer was lying. And that is still shocking to me because Annie Farmer went to the FBI in 1995 and we're sitting in this courtroom in 2021. There is so much evidence. Even the Epstein Compensation Fund has accepted her evidence. And yet still somehow these reporters believe this myth that if you wear something given to you by a groomer or an abuser, it means that person couldn't possibly have done anything wrong. So that's kind of the main thing that I really wish people understood about these victims is the things that you read in the paper or wherever, the things that people are trying to tell you are proof that they are lying or not credible. Those things are completely unscientific. They are not true. They are recognised as myths about rape. And so, I just wish more people knew that, so that when they did read things about these people trying to, discredit them, that they could say, okay, this person is using a myth to discredit someone who is in fact very, very credible.